When a powerful CEO crashes down a mountain during a corporate crisis, she never expected her rescue to come from a quiet single father living off the grid. One night in a storm shelter changed everything they thought they knew about love, sacrifice, and what really matters. But when their separate worlds collide again, she'll face the ultimate choice: billion-dollar profits, or the man who saved her soul. If you love stories of second chances, mountain rescues, and love that transcends social barriers, you're in for an emotional journey. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more heartwarming stories that prove love can bloom in the most unexpected places. Just one night, no names, no tomorrow. When a blizzard changed everything for two hearts, the powder was perfect. Too perfect. Susan Whitmore carved another turn down the pristine slope, her skis cutting precise lines through snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the afternoon sun. The remote Colorado mountains stretched endlessly before her, unmarked by other skiers, untouched by the chaos she'd left behind in the boardroom 3 hours earlier. Her phone buzzed again in her jacket pocket, the seventh time in 20 minutes. She ignored it. Up here at 12,000 feet, the betrayal felt smaller, somehow. Marcus's smug face across the conference table. The vote of no confidence. The whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room. Her own board members, the ones she'd handpicked, the ones who'd grown rich on her vision, turning against her like wolves sensing weakness. Susan pushed harder, faster. The wind whipped tears from her eyes. At least she could blame the cold for that. She should have seen it coming. 3 years of building Whitmore Logistics from a mid-sized shipping company into a global empire. And what did she have to show for it? A corner office that felt like a gilded cage. A penthouse apartment where she ate dinner alone most nights. And now, apparently, a board that thought she'd lost her edge. Maybe she had. The slope steepened. Susan welcomed the burn in her thighs, the way the mountain demanded everything from her balanced, focused respect. Mountains didn't care about quarterly earnings or stock prices. They didn't whisper behind your back or plot your downfall. They simply were. Her phone buzzed again. This time she yanked it out of her pocket without slowing down. Marcus's name on the screen. Her CFO, former friend, former confidant, now apparently leading the coup against her. What? She snapped into the phone, still skiing at dangerous speeds. Susan, thank God, where are you? Taking a break from watching my life's work get carved up by vultures. Look, about the meeting. About the meeting where my own board voted to remove me. Yeah, Marcus. What about it? The line crackled with static. It's not what you think. We can fix this. But I need you to come back. Tonight, the emergency meeting. There's an emergency meeting. Susan's voice climbed an octave. Jesus, Marcus, what else are you planning while I'm gone? Susan, you're breaking up. Where are you? She looked around properly for the first time. The ski run had narrowed. The groomed trail had given way to backcountry terrain, steeper, wilder, unpatrolled. Trees pressed in from both sides like silent witnesses. She realized she didn't actually know where she was. In her anger, she'd been following her skis rather than any marked trail. I'm fine. I'll be back tomorrow. Tomorrow might be too late. The words hit her like a physical blow. Tomorrow might be too late. Her company, her life's work slipping away while she fled to the mountains like some dramatic teenager. Susan? Susan, are you there? She was about to answer when she saw it. A shadow moving across the snow ahead of her. Too large, too fast. She looked up. The shelf of snow hanging from the rocky outcropping above was the size of a small building. It groaned audibly, a deep rumble that seemed to come from the mountain's bones. Time slowed. The phone slipped from her numb fingers, spinning away into the powder. The snow shelf cracked with a sound like thunder. Susan threw herself to the right, but she was going too fast, the slope too steep. The world tilted. Her skis caught an edge. She was airborne for a heartbeat, suspended between snow and sky before gravity reclaimed her. She hit the ground, hard tumbled, hit again. Snow filled her goggles, her mouth, her world. Something in her right leg screamed in protest. The avalanche roared behind her, but she was already falling into a different kind of white hell, rolling, bouncing trees, flashing past like fence posts. When she finally stopped, the silence was absolute. Susan lay in a drift 20 feet down from the main slope, her body twisted at angles that didn't feel right. Her left ski was gone. Her right leg throbbed with a deep, sick pain that made her stomach lurch. Blood dripped from her forehead onto the pristine snow, each drop spreading like watercolor. She tried to move. Fire shot up her leg, and she gasped the sound sharp in the thin air. Her phone was gone. Her ski was gone. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks with alarming speed, and she had no idea where she was. "Help," she whispered. Then louder, "Help." The mountains swallowed her voice without echo. The cold came first. It crept through her high-tech ski jacket past her thermal layers into her bones. Susan had never understood how quickly the mountain could turn from playground to predator. The sun disappeared behind the peaks, and the temperature plummeted 30 degrees in minutes. She tried again to move, managed to shift her weight enough to look around. She'd fallen into a natural bowl hidden from any main trail. Above her, the snow shelf had collapsed completely, leaving a scar of exposed rock and debris. If she'd been 10 feet further left, don't think about that. Her right leg was definitely broken. Maybe her ribs too breathing hurt. But she was alive conscious, not buried under tons of snow. That had to count for something. The first stars appeared overhead. Susan pulled out her emergency kit with shaking hands. A Mylar blanket, energy bars, a basic first aid kit. Items that had seemed ridiculous when the salesperson insisted she needed them. Now they looked pathetically inadequate against the vast indifference of the mountain. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and tried to think. Search and rescue would come looking eventually. Her car was in the resort parking lot. When she didn't return tonight, who would report her missing? The thought stopped her cold. Marcus might assume she'd driven back to Denver in a rage. Her assistant thought she was taking a long weekend. Her doorman was used to her disappearing for days at business trips. She lived alone, worked constantly, had no family, no romantic relationships that lasted longer than a few careful months. She was a ghost in her own life, and now she was becoming a literal one. The wind picked up, carrying ice crystals that stung her face. Susan pulled the Mylar blanket higher and settled in to wait. Surely someone would come. Surely. 3 hours later, hypothermia was winning. Susan's shivering had stopped, which she knew was a bad sign. Her thoughts moved like honey, thick and slow. The emergency blanket crackled around her like aluminum foil, reflecting her body heat back to her. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. She'd tried calling for help until her voice gave out. She'd attempted to fashion a splint for her leg from a broken ski pole and strips torn from her base layer. But the pain and cold were overwhelming, and her movements were becoming increasingly clumsy. The stars overhead were brilliant hard diamonds against black velvet. She'd never seen so many. In the city light, pollution washed out all but the brightest stars. Here, the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. It was beautiful. It was also the last thing she might ever see. Susan closed her eyes and tried to remember why she'd worked so hard. 18-hour days, weekends at the office, relationships sacrificed on the altar of quarterly growth. For what? A corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a view she never had time to appreciate. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 25, just as her career was taking off. She'd thrown herself into work to avoid the grief and then thrown herself deeper to avoid the loneliness. Somewhere along the way, work became her life, success became her identity, and she'd forgotten there might be anything else. Now there wouldn't be. The wind died to a whisper. In the sudden stillness, she heard it, the crunch of snow underfoot. Steady, rhythmic, getting closer. Susan's eyes snapped open. "Here," she called, her voice a broken rasp. "I'm here." A light bobbed between the trees, then another voice, deep and calm. "I hear you. Keep talking. I'm coming." Down here in the bowl. The light grew brighter. A figure emerged from the tree line, a man in winter gear moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in these mountains. He carried a large pack and what looked like climbing gear. "Okay, I see you," he called. "I'm Dan. I'm coming down." He rappelled into the bowl with practiced efficiency, landing softly in the snow beside her. Up close, Susan could see he was older than she'd first thought, maybe late 40s, with gray threaded through dark hair visible under his knit cap. His face was weathered but kind, with laugh lines around intelligent brown eyes. "Well, you've gotten yourself into quite a spot," he said gently, already unpacking medical supplies. "What's your name?" "Susan." "Nice to meet you, Susan. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" She gestured weakly at her leg. Dan nodded and began a careful examination, his hands sure and gentle. He moved like someone with medical training, checking her pupils, taking her pulse, testing her responses. Definitely a fracture in your tibia, he said after a moment. Probably a clean break, which is good news. Any other pain? Ribs, maybe. Hard to tell. You're hypothermic, but not too bad yet. When did you fall? Around 3, maybe 4. Dan glanced at his watch. It's almost midnight. You've been out here 8 hours. There was no judgment in his voice, just information. Are you search and rescue? Something flickered across his expression. Not exactly. I was camping nearby. Heard your calls for help. He was lying. Susan had built an empire reading people, understanding the small tells that revealed truth from fiction, but she was too cold and hurt to care about his motives. Dan worked efficiently, splinting her leg, wrapping her in his own sleeping bag on top of her emergency blanket. His gear was high quality, but well used, the kit of someone who spent serious time in the backcountry. We need to get you out of this wind, he said. There's a shelter about a quarter-mile from here. Can you handle being moved? Susan nodded. The alternative was freezing to death in a hole. Dan fashioned a rescue sled from his pack and some collapsible poles. The next 20 minutes were a blur of pain as he carefully transported her through the forest. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware mainly of the steady rhythm of his breathing and the confident way he navigated terrain that looked identical to her city-trained eyes. The shelter turned out to be a small log structure, barely more than a shed tucked between 2 massive pine trees. Inside was basic but adequate, a wood stove, sleeping platform, emergency supplies. Forest Service emergency shelter, Dan explained as he got a fire going, for situations exactly like this. Soon warmth began to penetrate Susan's bones for the first time in hours. Dan heated water, prepared food, checked her vital signs with the thoroughness of someone who knew what he was doing. And through it all, he was quiet in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. In her world, silence was dead air to be filled with presentations, conference calls, networking chatter. Here, silence was comfortable, natural. It allowed her to hear the fire crackling, the wind in the pines outside her own thoughts, without the constant buzz of ambition and anxiety. You're not search and rescue, she said when he handed her a cup of hot soup. Dan settled on the opposite side of the shelter, close enough to monitor her, but respecting her space. No. But you have medical training. Some. Susan studied his face in the firelight. Strong features, but gentle. Hands that were calloused from work, not manicures. What do you do? I used to be a paramedic, before that Army medic. He paused. Now I do carpentry mostly, build custom homes. In these mountains. There was a story there, she could feel it. But Dan didn't seem inclined to share, and she was too exhausted to push. The soup was warm and salty, and the best thing she'd ever tasted. What about you, Demo? He asked. Besides getting lost in avalanche country. Susan almost laughed. In her world, that question would have launched into a 15-minute elevator pitch about Whitmore Logistics, their global reach, their innovative supply chain solutions. Here, wrapped in a stranger's sleeping bag, in a tiny cabin, that life seemed absurd. I run a company, she said instead. What kind of company? The kind that apparently runs better without me. Dan looked at her over his own cup of coffee. Bad day, bad year, bad decade maybe. She told him about the board meeting, Marcus's betrayal, the vote of no confidence. It spilled out of her in a way that surprised her, unfiltered, unstrategic, just raw frustration and hurt. Dan listened without offering advice or trying to fix anything. He just listened, which was something else Susan had almost forgotten was possible. Why were you out here? She asked eventually. Really? Dan was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, my wife died 3 years ago, cancer. I come up here on the anniversary. She loved these mountains. I'm sorry. She was everything good about my world. When she died, I couldn't figure out how to live in the same places around the same people. So I moved up here. You have kids. A daughter, Emma. She's 14 now. Dan's face softened. She splits time between here and her grandmother's place in town. Needs more civilization than the mountains can offer. Susan tried to imagine it, losing someone so fundamental that you had to rebuild your entire existence around the absence. It was beyond her experience. She'd never let anyone get close enough to leave that kind of crater. That must be hard, she said. Different kind of hard than what you're dealing with, I guess. They lapsed into comfortable silence. The fire popped and settled. Outside, an owl called through the darkness. Dan, sure, yeah. Thank you for finding me, for this. She gestured around the small cabin. You don't need to thank me. I do. I would have died out there. He met her eyes across the fire. You're not going to die. Not tonight. Something in his voice made her believe it. For the first time in hours, Susan felt truly safe. Susan woke to gray morning light filtering through frost-covered windows. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the pain in her leg reminded her, and the events of the previous night came rushing back. The cabin was smaller than she'd realized in the firelight. Maybe 12 feet by 8 with rough-hewn log walls and a corrugated metal roof. Dan was already awake tending the fire, moving with the quiet efficiency she was beginning to recognize as his natural state. How do you feel? He asked without turning around. Like I fell down a mountain. She tried to shift position and winced. But warmer. Good, that's progress. He brought her coffee in a dented metal cup along with what looked like homemade bread and jam. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and she'd never tasted anything better. Where did this come from? She asked, gesturing at the food. Emergency cash. I restock these shelters a couple times a year. You maintain them? Dan shrugged. Someone has to. Forest Service budget only goes so far. Susan studied him in the morning light. Yesterday she'd been too cold and shocked to really see him. Now she noticed the way he moved, economical, purposeful, never wasting motion. His hands were scarred from work, but gentle when he checked her splint. He was handsome in a weathered way that had nothing to do with expensive haircuts or personal trainers. How long have you been doing this? She asked. Couple years, since I moved up here full time. And before that? Before that, I lived in Denver, worked for an ambulance service, had a house in the suburbs, a mortgage neighbors who borrowed my lawnmower. Dan poked at the fire. Normal stuff. What made you leave? He was quiet for a long moment. After Sarah died, everything felt wrong. The house was too big and too empty. The neighbors meant well, but they kept looking at me like I was broken. And Emma, he paused. Emma was drowning in all that sympathy. She needed space to grieve without everyone watching. Susan couldn't imagine making such a radical change. Her entire identity was tied up in her corporate life, her Manhattan address, the external markers of success. Weren't you afraid? Terrified. Dan smiled slightly. But Sarah used to say fear was just excitement wearing a disguise. She was always pushing me to take risks, try new things. Moving to the mountains was probably the scariest thing I'd ever done. But it was also the first thing that felt right after she died. They ate in comfortable silence. Through the small window, Susan could see snow falling in fat, lazy flakes. The storm that had threatened yesterday was moving in. How long before search and rescue finds us? She asked. Dan glanced outside. With this weather, could be a while. I can try to hike out for help, but in these conditions. No, honey. The word came out sharper than she'd intended. I mean, don't risk yourself for me. I'm warm, I'm fed, my leg is stabilized. We can wait. The truth was she wasn't ready to be rescued. Out here, the catastrophe of her board meeting felt distant and unreal. Marcus and his conspirators seemed less important than the simple rhythm of feeding the fire-melting snow for water, sharing meals with a man who expected nothing from her except honest conversation. When was the last time she'd spent a day without checking email, without making a single business decision, without performing the role of CEO? Susan Whitmore. Tell me about your daughter, she said. Dan's entire demeanor shifted, becoming warmer and more animated. She's incredible. Smarter than me, braver than me, definitely more stubborn than me. She wants to be a marine biologist, spends every summer researching tidal pools and writing papers that are better than most grad students could manage. She sounds amazing. She is. Sarah would be so proud of who she's becoming. Dan's voice caught slightly. Sometimes I catch Emma making the same expression Sarah used to make when she was thinking hard about something. It's the best and worst thing in the world. Susan found herself leaning forward. Do you think you'll ever remarry? For Emma's sake, I mean. Give her a mother figure. Dan looked at her strangely. Is that what people do? Remarry for practical reasons? The question hung in the air between them. Susan realized she'd been thinking like a CEO again, analyzing the situation, optimizing for outcomes. It was exactly the kind of calculated approach that had led to her own disastrous marriage. I don't know, she admitted. I've never done anything that wasn't practical. What about love? What about it? Have you ever been in love? Really in love, not just convenient companionship. Susan considered lying. In her world, admitting emotional failure was like showing weakness in a business negotiation. But something about the firelight and the snow and Dan's genuine curiosity made her want to be honest. No, she said finally. I thought I was once. But looking back, I think I was just in love with the idea of having successfully acquired a husband. Like a merger that looked good on paper but had no real synergy. Dan laughed and the sound filled the small cabin. You talk about marriage like a business deal. Because that's what it was. Thomas was a partner at a prestigious law firm. I was an up-and-coming executive. We looked good together at corporate events. Our wedding announcement made the business section of 3 newspapers. That sounds awful. It was efficient. Susan paused. It was also completely hollow. We lived in the same house for 4 years and barely knew each other. When we divorced, the only thing we fought about was who got to keep the corporate box seats to the symphony. Do you miss it being married? I miss the idea of it, coming home to someone who cares how your day went, having someone to share meals with, someone whose opinion matters when you're making big decisions. Susan stared into the fire. But I've never had that, not really. What about your company? That seems like something you care about passionately. Susan laughed, but there was no humor in it. Yesterday I would have said yes, but sitting here, I'm not even sure why I wanted it so badly. Maybe because it was the one thing I was good at, building something, growing it, winning. Winning against who? The question stopped her short. Everyone, I guess. Competitors, market forces, my own limitations. That sounds exhausting. It was exhausting. Susan realized she hadn't had a real vacation in 5 years. She worked weekends, holidays, even her wedding anniversary, which probably explained why that marriage had failed. Her entire sense of self-worth was tied to quarterly growth numbers and stock prices. What do you do for fun? Dan asked. Fun. You know, enjoyment, pleasure, things you do because they make you happy, not because they advance some goal. Susan genuinely couldn't think of an answer. Skiing maybe, but even that had become more about physical achievement than joy. She read business biographies. She went to networking events disguised as charity galas. She bought expensive things she didn't have time to enjoy. I don't think I know how to have fun anymore, she said quietly. Dan was looking at her with something that might have been pity, but felt more like understanding. When's the last time you watched a sunset just because it was beautiful? I can't remember, When's the last time you had a conversation that wasn't about work? Susan gestured around the cabin. This one. Exactly. They sat in silence, both staring into the fire. Outside, the snow was falling harder, creating a white cocoon around their small shelter. Susan felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the simple pleasure of being present in a moment without needing to optimize it or monetize it or move on to the next task. Dan, yeah. Why didn't you ask my last name? He considered this. Because it doesn't matter. You're Susan. You're hurt and you're lost, and you're in my care until you're not. Your last name won't change any of that. In Susan's world, her last name was everything. It opened doors, commanded respect, preceded her into every room and conversation. The idea that someone could care for her without knowing her identity or calculating how she might be useful was so foreign it almost didn't compute. You really don't know who I am. Should I? Susan laughed, really laughed for the first time in months. No, you shouldn't. And that's the most refreshing thing anyone said to me in years. As the day wore on, Susan found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't realized were possible. Dan moved around the small space with practiced ease, maintaining the fire, preparing simple meals, checking her injury with gentle competence. He didn't fill every silence with chatter. He didn't seem to need anything from her, not conversation, not entertainment, not validation. It was the opposite of every relationship she'd ever had. Tell me about carpentry, she said as he whittled a piece of wood by the fire. What do you want to know? Everything. Why you chose it, what you build, what you like about it. Dan's hands stilled on the wood. You really want to know? I really want to know. Most people's eyes glaze over when I start talking about wood grain and joinery techniques. I'm not most people. No, Dan said, looking at her with something approaching wonder. You're really not. He told her about learning the craft from his father-in-law, about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional with his hands. He described the different qualities of various woods, the way cedar smelled when you cut into it, how oak demanded respect for its strength and stubbornness. There's something honest about wood, he said, shaping the piece in his hands with careful strokes of the knife. It tells you exactly what it is. You can't force it to be something it's not, but if you work with its natural qualities, you can create something incredible. Susan found herself mesmerized by the movement of his hands, the careful precision of each cut. What are you making, figure of eight? He held up the emerging shape. Emma collects them. I make one every time I'm up here. It's beautiful. It's simple, but sometimes simple is enough. Susan thought about her penthouse apartment full of expensive art she'd bought because her decorator said it was important. Pieces chosen for their investment potential rather than because they moved her. When was the last time she'd owned something simply because it was beautiful? Can you teach me? Dan looked surprised. To carve, why not? I have time, you have expertise. Consider it payment for the rescue. You don't owe me anything. I know. I want to learn. Please. He handed her the knife and a fresh piece of wood, guiding her hands to the proper grip. His fingers were warm and calloused against hers, steadying her movements as she made the first tentative cuts. Feel the grain, he said quietly. Don't fight it. Work with what the wood wants to be. It was harder than it looked. Susan's first attempts to produce more wood shavings than recognizable shapes. But gradually, under Dan's patient guidance, she began to understand the rhythm of it. The way the blade needed to follow the wood's natural patterns rather than imposing her will upon it. You're thinking too hard, Dan observed. Stop trying to control the outcome. Just focus on this one cut, then the next one. I'm not good at letting go of control. I noticed. Susan laughed despite herself. Is it that obvious? You've been checking your jacket pocket for your phone every 10 minutes since you woke up, even though you know it's gone. And you've asked me 3 times if I think the weather will clear so you can get back to the city. She had been doing exactly that. Even here in a place where her corporate crisis couldn't touch her, she was still mentally rehearsing damage control strategies and calculating how quickly she could get back to fight for her company. It's hard to turn off, she admitted. What would happen if you did just for today? The world would probably end. Dan smiled. The world's been ending and beginning again every day for billions of years. Usually manages just fine without our help. Susan looked down at the piece of wood in her hands. It was starting to resemble something, not the elegant figure Dan was creating, but something uniquely hers. Imperfect, but honest. When Sarah was sick, Dan continued, I tried to control everything. Her treatment schedule, her diet, her environment. Thought if I just managed the situation well enough, I could force a different outcome. Did it help? It nearly drove us both crazy. Finally, she sat me down and said, Dan, you can control your actions, but you can't control the results. The only thing we really control is how we choose to spend the time we have. Susan felt something tight in her chest loosening. She sounds wise. She was, still is in some ways. When I'm working with wood, I try to remember that lesson. You can plan and measure and prepare, but ultimately you have to trust the process. Shine, let it become what it wants to become. They worked in companionable silence as the afternoon light faded. Susan found herself falling into the rhythm of the carving, her mind quieting in a way it hadn't in years. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them away from the world. When Dan started preparing dinner, Susan realized she hadn't thought about Whitmore logistics for over 2 hours. The recognition should have panicked her. Instead, it felt like relief. Dan, thank you. For what this time? For letting me be nobody for a while. He looked up from the camp stove, his expression soft in the firelight. You're not nobody, Susan. You're just yourself, without all the rest of it. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in years. So, Night fell early in the mountains, and with it came an intimacy that surprised them both. The small cabin, the flickering firelight, the sense of being completely cut off from the outside world. It created a space outside normal time and social conventions. They talked about books, about music, about places they'd traveled, and dreams they'd abandoned. Susan found herself telling Dan things she'd never shared with anyone, her fear that she'd sacrificed everything human in herself for professional success, her growing certainty that even if she saved her company, she might not save herself. "What would you do differently?" Dan asked. "If you could start over, everything." The answer surprised her with its immediacy. "I'd work less. I'd make friends who weren't contacts. I'd learn to cook something besides heating up takeout. I'd have houseplants and pets and hobbies that served no strategic purpose." She paused. "I'd try to be a person instead of just a title." "It's not too late." "Well, isn't it? I'm 50 years old. I don't know how to be anything except what I am." "Neither did I, but you learn." Dan told her about his first months in the mountains, the loneliness, the practical challenges, the way he had questioned the decision daily, how gradually he'd learned to find peace in the simpler rhythms of a life lived closer to the natural world. "Emma was the one who really convinced me to stay," he said. "She came up here for a weekend and fell in love with it immediately. Said it was the first place that felt like home since her mom died." "She's lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one. She saved me from turning into a hermit completely. Keeps me connected to the world, to what matters." Susan felt a stab of something that might have been envy. She'd never had that kind of connection, someone whose well-being mattered more than her own ambitions, someone who could anchor her to what was real and important. "Do you ever regret it, leaving your old life?" Dan was quiet for a long time. "I regret the circumstances that forced the choice. But the life I have now, it's more honest, more mine. I wake up every morning and choose how to spend my time based on what matters to me, not what's expected of me." "That sounds terrifying." "It is sometimes, but it's also freedom." They were sitting closer now, the cold driving them toward the fire and each other. Susan was acutely aware of Dan's presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way the firelight played across his features, the quiet competence that seemed to emanate from him like warmth. "Susan, yeah, are you warm enough?" She wasn't actually. The temperature had dropped with the sun, and despite the fire, the small cabin held cold in its corners like a living thing. But more than that, she was lonely in a way that had nothing to do with being physically alone. "Not really," she admitted. Without a word, Dan moved closer, opening his sleeping bag to share the warmth. Susan hesitated for a moment in her world. Such intimacy was either transactional or strategically risky. But here in this place, outside normal rules, it felt natural. She settled against his side, feeling his warmth seep through her layers of clothing. His arm came around her shoulders, solid and reassuring. It was the first non-professional physical contact she'd had with anyone in months, and the simple human comfort of it made her eyes burn. "Better?" he asked quietly. "Better." They sat like that as the fire burned down, sharing warmth and silence, and something that felt dangerously close to connection. Susan found herself studying Dan's profile in the dying light, the strong line of his jaw, the laugh lines around his eyes, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He was nothing like the men she usually dated. No expensive suits, no competitive edge, no agenda beyond simple kindness. He asked for nothing from her and expected nothing. He'd rescued her not because of who she was, but because she was human and in need. It was the most attractive thing she'd ever encountered. "Dan." He turned to look at her, and suddenly they were very close, breathing the same air, sharing the same space in a way that made the small cabin feel even smaller. "Thank you," she whispered, "for all of this, for seeing me." "Susan." She didn't let him finish. Instead, she closed the small distance between them and kissed him. For a moment, he went very still. Then his hand came up to cup the back of her head, and he was kissing her back with a tenderness that made her heart race. When they broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "We don't have to," Dan started. "I know," Susan said, "but I want to, if you do." He searched her face in the firelight. "Are you sure?" Instead of answering, she kissed him again. This time there was nothing tentative about it. They made love slowly, carefully mindful of Susan's injuries and the strange intimacy of their circumstances. It was nothing like the efficient, performative encounters Susan was used to. This was exploration, discovery, a conversation conducted in sighs and touches and whispered names. Dan was gentle but not tentative, present in a way that made Susan feel seen and wanted for herself rather than what she represented. When he traced the line of her collarbone with his finger, when he murmured her name against her throat, she felt beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with expensive clothes or careful grooming. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sleeping bags, the fire reduced to glowing embers, the cabin filled with intimate shadows. That was, Susan started, then stopped, not sure how to finish. Unexpected, Dan supplied softly. I was going to say perfect. He turned to look at her, his expression serious. Susan, you know this can't, we live in completely different worlds. When morning comes, she pressed a finger to his lips. I know. I know this is just this moment, this place. I'm not asking for anything beyond tonight. But even as she said it, she felt the words ring false. Already she was trying to imagine how this could work, how she might bridge the vast gap between their lives. The thought terrified her. Just tonight, Dan agreed quietly. No names, no histories, no tomorrows, just us. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, the mountain wind sighing through the pines outside their temporary refuge. Susan woke to the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the morning air. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then Dan stirred beside her, and the events of the past 2 days came rushing back, the fall, the rescue, the night that had changed something fundamental in her understanding of herself. Search and rescue, Dan said, already moving with efficient purpose. The weather must have cleared. Through the cabin window, Susan could see blue sky for the first time since her accident. The helicopter circled once, twice, then found a place to land in a clearing 50 yards away. Reality crashed back like a cold wave. Susan sat up her leg, protesting the movement, and began pulling on her clothes. In minutes, this perfect bubble of time would burst, and she would go back to being CEO Susan Whitmore with her broken company and her empty penthouse and her life that suddenly seemed impossible to bear. Dan was dressing too, his movements economical but somehow final. The easy intimacy of the night before was already fading, replaced by the awkward awareness that they were strangers who had shared something profound under extraordinary circumstances. Susan, he started, but she cut him off. Don't, please, let's not complicate it with words. The rescue team arrived with professional efficiency, checking her vitals, stabilizing her leg, preparing her for transport. Susan answered their questions automatically, gave them the information they needed, played the role of grateful victim. But her eyes kept finding Dan. He stood apart from the activity, letting the professionals work. But his presence was a steady anchor in the controlled chaos. When the lead paramedic announced they were ready to move her, Dan approached the stretcher. Take care of yourself, he said quietly. You too. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something else. Instead, he reached out and briefly touched her hand, a contact so fleeting it might have been imagination. Then Susan was being loaded into the helicopter, and the mountain was falling away beneath her, and Dan was a small figure growing smaller until he disappeared entirely among the trees. The return to civilization was jarring. First, the hospital in Denver, x-rays and surgery to set her leg properly, concerned doctors and efficient nurses, and the sterile smell of antiseptic that was the opposite of wood smoke and pine air. Then the media circus. Somehow a word had gotten out that CEO Susan Whitmore had been rescued after being lost in the mountains for 2 days. The local news picked it up first, then the business press, then social media. By the time she was discharged from the hospital, there were photographers waiting outside her penthouse building. The official story was simple enough: a skiing accident, a night of exposure, a routine rescue by search and rescue teams. No one asked about the cabin or the man who had saved her life. It was as if those 2 days had happened to someone else entirely. Marcus was waiting in her apartment, of course, along with her lawyer, her PR team, and a stack of documents that required her immediate attention. Thank God you're all right, he said, and for a moment she almost believed he meant it. But Susan, we need to talk. The board situation has gotten more complicated while you were gone. Susan settled into her own living room like a guest in a hotel. Everything looked exactly as she'd left it: the expensive furniture, the carefully curated art, the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a view of Central Park she never had time to appreciate. It felt like a museum exhibit, how a successful executive lives. What's the situation, she asked. Marcus launched into a detailed briefing. In her absence, two more board members had joined the faction, calling for her resignation. A major client was threatening to pull their contract. Stock prices had dropped 8%. The quarterly earnings call was in 3 days, and the board was insisting that Marcus present instead of her. "We can still fix this," Marcus said earnestly, "but you need to be strategic. Maybe take a step back, become chairman emeritus. Let me handle the day-to-day operations for a while." Susan listened to his words, but all she could think about was Dan's voice. "You can control your actions, but you can't control the results." "What do you want, Marcus?" she asked quietly. He looked surprised by the directness of the question. "I want what's best for the company. And you think that's you running it instead of me. I think maybe you've lost perspective. This mountain adventure disappearing when the company needed you most, it shows questionable judgment." Susan studied the man she'd once considered her closest ally. Marcus had been her CFO for 5 years, her friend for longer. She'd trusted him with everything. Now she could see the calculation behind his concern, the way he'd positioned himself to benefit from her crisis. "You orchestrated this," she said. It wasn't a question. "Susan, you're being paranoid. You've been planning this takeover for months, maybe years. The board members, the client pressure, even the timing of the vote while I was away, you orchestrated all of it." Marcus didn't deny it. He didn't need to. The confirmation was written across his face. "Why, Guy?" "Why?" she asked. "Because you've been checked out for years, going through the motions, collecting your salary, but not really leading. The company needs someone who wants to be there." The accusation stung because it contained truth. She had been going through the motions, had been leading from habit rather than passion. But it wasn't because she didn't care about the company, it was because she'd forgotten how to care about anything. Until 2 days in a mountain cabin reminded her what caring felt like. "I'll fight you," she said. "You'll lose, you don't have the votes." "Maybe, but I'll make it expensive and public and ugly. Your investors won't thank you for a protracted battle that tanks the stock price." Marcus leaned forward, his mask finally slipping completely. "Or you could take the generous waiver severance package we're offering and walk away with some dignity intact." Susan almost laughed. Dignity. As if there was any dignity in surrendering the life's work to a coup orchestrated by someone she'd trusted. But then she thought about Dan's quiet confidence, his willingness to leave everything familiar to build a life that felt authentic. She thought about his daughter Emma, who was brave enough to pursue her dreams of studying marine biology. She thought about the way Dan had looked at her in the firelight, not seeing the CEO or the title or the stock options, but seeing her. "I need time to think," she said. "Susan, the earnings call is in 3 days. I said I need time." After they left, Susan sat alone in her pristine apartment and tried to figure out who she was when she wasn't fighting for something. The question felt impossible to answer. Her phone buzzed constantly, reporters wanting statements, board members wanting meetings, analysts wanting projections. She ignored them all. Instead, she found herself Googling Dan Carter, Colorado carpenter. The search returned dozens of results, none of them helpful. She tried Emma Carter, marine biology, and found a few academic competition results from Denver area schools. She could find him if she wanted to. Hire a private investigator, use her resources and connections. Track him down and disrupt his peaceful mountain life with her corporate drama. The thought made her feel sick. 3 days later, Susan stood in the boardroom of Whitmore Logistics for what might be the last time as CEO. The quarterly earnings call was scheduled to start in an hour. The board members were filing in, their faces carefully neutral. Marcus sat at the far end of the table, flanked by allies. Susan had prepared 2 speeches. One was a detailed plan for fighting back, restructuring, the board replacing key personnel, launching an aggressive expansion strategy that would prove her continued value as a leader. It was brilliant, comprehensive, and would probably save her job. The other speech was 2 sentences long. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, standing at the head of the table she'd commanded for 7 years. "I've given considerable thought to the company's future and my role in it." The room fell silent. Marcus leaned forward slightly, probably expecting a capitulation. "Effective immediately, I'm resigning as CEO of Whitmore Logistics. I'm also divesting my entire stake in the company, and donating the proceeds to establish a foundation for mountain rescue operations in wilderness safety education. The silence that followed was deafening. Susan, Marcus said carefully, let's not be hasty. I'm not being hasty, I'm being honest. This company was my entire life for 15 years, but I've realized that having something be your whole life and having it be worth your whole life are not the same thing. She looked around the table at faces that had become familiar over years of meetings, negotiations, strategic planning sessions, people she'd thought were friends but who turned out to be business associates. The distinction mattered more than she'd ever realized. You'll do fine without me, she continued. Better, probably. You're all talented, driven people who care about quarterly growth and market position and shareholder value. Those are important things. They're just not my things anymore. Marcus stood up. Susan, let's discuss this privately. You're making a mistake that you'll regret. The only thing I regret is taking so long to figure out who I actually am when I'm not performing the role of CEO. Susan gathered her things and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she turned back one last time. Good luck, she said and meant it. Build something you can be proud of. Then she left, walking out of her corporate life the same way she'd walked into the mountain cabin, with no clear plan except to trust the process and see what emerged. The liquidation of her assets took 6 weeks. Susan had accumulated wealth the way some people accumulated dust, gradually without much conscious thought, until it was everywhere. The penthouse apartment, the portfolio of stocks and bonds, the vacation home in the Hamptons she'd visited twice in 5 years, the art collection chosen by professionals, the jewelry she never wore. All of it converted to cash, transferred to lawyers, transformed into the Susan Whitmore Foundation for Mountain Safety. Her accountants were horrified. Her lawyer begged her to reconsider. The financial press called it either a nervous breakdown or a brilliant tax strategy. Susan didn't care what they called it. With the bureaucratic machinery in motion, she had time to think about what came next. The obvious answer was another CEO position. There were already headhunters calling companies interested in her reputation for growing in logistics operations. She could probably have her pick of opportunities. But when she tried to imagine walking into another boardroom, another executive suite, another life built around quarterly projections and strategic initiatives, she felt physically nauseated. Instead, she bought a reliable used car and started driving west. She had no destination in mind, just a vague intention to see the country without airports and hotels and business meetings. Somewhere around Kansas, she realized she was heading for Colorado. Somewhere around Denver, she admitted to herself why. She didn't have a plan. Showing up at Dan's door uninvited seemed presumptuous, at best stalkerish, at worst. But she found herself driving mountain roads anyway, ostensibly looking for places the foundation might fund rescue operations, actually hoping for some sign of where he might be. She found him by accident on a Tuesday morning in late October. Susan had stopped for coffee in a small town called Pine Ridge, population 847, according to the weather-faded sign at the city limits. The cafe was the kind of place that existed in every mountain community. Mismatched furniture, local art on the walls, a bulletin board covered with flyers for lost cats and community meetings. She was reading a notice about winter preparedness classes when a familiar voice said, "Susan." She turned and there he was. Dan looked exactly the same, weathered jacket, work boots, the same quiet confidence that had drawn her to him in the cabin. But his expression was one of complete shock. "Hi," she said lamely. "What are you? How did you?" He seemed to collect himself. "It's good to see you. Are you all right? Your leg?" "Fine, healed completely. I'm fine." They stared at each other across the small cafe, other customers glancing curiously at the reunion. Finally, Dan gestured toward an empty table. "Do you want to sit? I was just taking a break from work." "I don't want to interrupt." "You're not interrupting." They sat across from each other like cautious negotiators. Susan ordered coffee she didn't want, just to have something to do with her hands. "What are you doing here?" Dan asked gently. "I don't know," Susan answered honestly. "I was driving through and I don't know what I thought." "How's the company?" "Gone. I resigned, sold everything, gave it all away to start a foundation for mountain rescue operations." Dan's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "You what?" "It turns out you were right about controlling outcomes. I couldn't save the company, but I could choose how I responded to losing it. So I chose to lose it on my own terms." Susan, that's incredible. Are you okay with it? I'm terrified. I have no idea who I am if I'm not CEO of something. I own almost nothing except this car and a suitcase full of hiking clothes I bought in Denver. I've never not had a 5-year plan. She paused. But I also haven't checked my email in 3 days, and the world hasn't ended. Dan was looking at her with something that might have been admiration. What will you do now? I thought maybe I'd learn to carve wood. Really learn not just the emergency crash course you gave me in the cabin. Susan, I know it's presumptuous. I know we had one night that meant more to me than it probably did to you. But that night showed me something about who I could be if I stopped performing who I thought I was supposed to be. And I was hoping, I thought maybe. She ran out of words. In the corporate world, she'd been a master of persuasive presentations, but this felt too important for strategy. Dan reached across the table and took her hand. His fingers were still calloused, still warm. Emma's been asking about you, he said quietly. About me. I told her about the rescue. She's been worried that you might have lasting trauma from the hypothermia exposure. Wants to know if you developed any psychological symptoms. Susan almost smiled. Smart kid. Too smart for her own good sometimes. But she'd like to meet you if you're sticking around. Are you asking me to stick around? Dan was quiet for a long moment. That night in the cabin was the first time since Sarah died that I felt connected to someone. Really connected, not just going through the motions of human interaction. I thought about trying to find you, but your world and mine don't exist anymore. My world doesn't exist anymore. I made sure of that. So what world do you live in now? Susan looked around the small cafe at the mountain town outside the windows at Dan's familiar face across the table. I guess I'm still figuring that out. But I was hoping maybe I could figure it out here, if that's okay with you. Dan squeezed her hand. It's more than okay. But I should warn you, the learning curve for mountain living is steep, especially this close to winter. I'm not afraid of steep learning curves. I built a company from nothing, remember? This is different. This is about learning to be still, learning to be present, learning to find meaning in small things rather than big achievements. Susan thought about the piece of wood she'd carved in the cabin, imperfect but hers. About watching Dan work with tools and materials, creating something beautiful and functional with his hands. About the way Emma's eyes lit up when Dan talked about her research projects. I want to learn all of that, she said. I want to learn how to be Susan, just Susan, not Susan the CEO, or Susan who built an empire. I want to learn how to care about things that don't have quarterly projections. Dan smiled and the expression transformed his entire face. In that case, welcome to Pine Ridge. Population now 848. 6 months later, Susan woke up in Dan's bed to the sound of Emma arguing with someone on the phone about tide pool preservation policies. Dad, Emma called from the kitchen, tell whoever's in charge of marine protected areas that their current regulations are scientifically inadequate and environmentally irresponsible. I don't think I'm qualified to have that conversation. Dan called back, amused. Then Susan should call them. She knows how to talk to bureaucrats. Susan smiled into her pillow. In the past 6 months, she'd learned to split firewood, identify edible plants, navigate by stars, and find satisfaction in small daily tasks rather than huge strategic victories. She'd also learned that Emma Carter was a force of nature who treated her like family with the casual authority of a teenager who decided someone belonged. Susan's not in charge of marine policy, Dan replied. She's in charge of mountain rescue funding. Different bureaucracy. All bureaucracies are fundamentally the same, Emma announced with the confidence of someone who'd never actually dealt with bureaucracy but had read extensively about institutional systems. They're just organized incompetence with official letterheads. Susan laughed and got out of bed. Through the window, she could see snow falling on the pines around Dan's cabin. Their cabin now, she supposed, though they'd never formally discussed the living arrangement. It had just evolved naturally the way everything in this new life seemed to happen. The Whitmore Foundation was thriving under the management of people who actually understood mountain rescue operations. Susan served on the board and occasionally flew to meetings in cities that now felt foreign and overstimulating. But mostly she lived quietly in Pine Ridge, learning carpentry from Dan, helping Emma with college applications, and discovering what it meant to build a life based on relationships rather than achievements. It wasn't always easy. Some days she missed the adrenaline rush of high-stakes business decisions. Some days she felt lost without external validation of her worth. Some days she worried that she'd made a terrible mistake, giving up everything she'd worked for. But then Dan would come home with sawdust in his hair and kiss her like she was the best part of his day. Or Emma would share some fascinating discovery about marine ecosystems, her face glowing with passion for knowledge. Or she'd wake up in the mountains and remember what it felt like to be present in her own life instead of constantly racing toward the next goal. "Coffee's ready," Dan announced as she entered the kitchen. "Thank you." Susan kissed his cheek and accepted the mug he handed her, handmade pottery from a local artist. Nothing like the expensive china that had filled her Manhattan penthouse. "Emma's trying to save the ocean again," he said fondly. "Someone has to." Emma looked up from her laptop. "Susan, you should meet my friend Rachel's mom. She's a marine biologist at the university, and she's been fighting this ridiculous development project that would destroy critical habitat for—" "Emma," Dan interrupted gently, "let Susan have her coffee before you recruit her for environmental activism." "I'm not recruiting, I'm educating. There's a difference." Susan settled at the kitchen table and looked out at the snow-covered forest. A year ago, she'd been preparing for quarterly earnings calls and strategic planning meetings. Now she was listening to a teenager explain the economic value of biodiversity while her father prepared breakfast for the three of them. It was better, different, smaller in scope, less dramatic in its daily fluctuations, but better. "Susan," Emma said suddenly, "are you happy here?" The question was asked with characteristic teenage directness, but Susan could hear the underlying concern. Emma had already lost one mother figure. She'd grown attached to Susan over the past months, but she was also protective of the family stability she'd found with Dan. "I'm happier than I've ever been," Susan answered honestly. "Even without your company, even without all the success stuff." Susan considered the question seriously. Success had been her primary identity for so long that learning to define herself differently was still a work in progress. But when she tried to imagine going back to her old life, the constant pressure, the strategic maneuvering, the way every relationship had been filtered through calculations of professional advantage, she felt claustrophobic. "The success stuff was never actually mine," she said finally. "It was something I did, but it wasn't who I was. I just got confused about the difference." "So who are you now?" "I'm figuring it out. But I think I'm someone who carves wood and funds rescue operations and argues with bureaucrats about marine policy because someone I care about thinks it's important." Emma grinned. "That's a pretty good person to be." "I think so too." Dan set plates of eggs and bacon in front of them, then settled into his own chair with the contentment of someone whose life had found its proper rhythm. Outside, the snow continued to fall, adding to the accumulation that would keep them close to home for the next few days. Susan had learned to love the enforced stillness of mountain winters, the way snow created natural boundaries that encouraged turning inward rather than always reaching outward. It was the opposite of her old life, where being snowed in would have meant laptop work and conference calls, and frustration at the interruption to her schedule. "What's the plan for today?" Dan asked. "I need to finish my college essays," Emma said. "And someone needs to call the marine sanctuary people about the development permits." "I'll make the calls," Susan offered, "after I help you with the essays." Emma had applied to marine biology programs at 5 universities, each application requiring essays that showcased her passion and qualifications. Susan had been surprised to discover how much she enjoyed helping with the writing process. It reminded her of the strategic thinking that she had used in business, but applied to something that mattered to someone she loved rather than something that would increase quarterly profits. "What about you?" Emma asked Dan. "Besides the obvious." The obvious was the rocking chair Dan was building for Mrs. Henderson, who was expecting her first grandchild. He'd been working on it for weeks, crafting each piece with the kind of attention to detail that Susan had once reserved for merger negotiations. "I thought maybe we could start planning the spring edition," Dan said. "If Susan's serious about staying long-term." They'd been talking about adding a small office space to the cabin somewhere. Susan could work on foundation business, and Emma could spread out her research projects. It would be Susan's first permanent modification to a space since she'd sold her penthouse, the first time in months she'd made plans that extended beyond the immediate future. "I'm serious," Susan said. "If you're sure you want me cluttering up your perfect mountain bachelor pad." I think we're past the bachelor phase, Dan replied dryly. Thank God, Emma added. Dad was getting weird about doing his own laundry, and his cooking was becoming tragic. My cooking was fine. Dad, you were putting canned beans on everything. Everything. I found you putting them on pancakes. Susan laughed, remembering her own culinary disasters during the first weeks of independence. Learning to cook for pleasure rather than efficiency had been one of the unexpected challenges of her new life. But Dan had been patient with her burned attempts at bread making, and Emma had cheerfully critiqued her experimental vegetable dishes until she found combinations that actually worked. They were building something together, not a business or a strategic alliance, but a family. Unconventional, improvised, based on choice rather than obligation. It was the first thing Susan had ever built that felt completely hers. Her phone rang. The number was from New York, probably someone from the foundation board with updates or questions. A year ago, such calls would have interrupted everything, demanded immediate attention, regardless of the personal moment they invaded. Now Susan looked at the phone, then at Dan and Emma across the breakfast table, and sent the call to voicemail. Everything okay? Dan asked. Everything's perfect, Susan said and meant it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them into their small world of shared meals and quiet conversation, and the kind of love that grew slowly, naturally, without strategy or timeline. It was exactly the life Susan had never known she wanted. And for the first time since she'd fallen down that mountain 6 months ago, she felt like she'd finally landed somewhere that felt like home. Thank you for joining Susan and Dan on their incredible journey from a life-changing mountain rescue to finding true love in the most unexpected circumstances. Sometimes we have to lose everything we thought we wanted to discover what we actually need. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of second chances and unexpected love. Share this story with someone who might need to be reminded that it's never too late to choose a different path, and that sometimes the best rescue comes not from others saving us, but from learning to save ourselves. What would you choose? The corner office or the mountain cabin? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest heartwarming stories. Until next time, remember that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, especially when we're brave enough to let go of who we think we're supposed to be and embrace who we truly are.